Now we are officially recording, so I can officially welcome you this morning to our conference, Bridging Worlds, ERPL as a Driver for Lifelong Learning, Collaboration and Innovation in Practice. My name is Ciara. I am going to be your host and moderator for the day. We are delighted to welcome you all to this morning's conference. Such a diverse background of individuals. We have 270 participants joining us from across the world, 39 countries represented. So it's a wonderful diversity of practitioners, educators, policymakers, and all of those who are interested in the recognition of prior learning. So we have a busy morning ahead. Let me just give you a sense of the schedule for the morning. So over the course of the morning, we are going to bring you on a little bit of a journey. We are going to start this morning's session with this first session on ERPL as a bridge for lifelong learning and stakeholder engagement. And we're going to receive some very interesting inputs from a number of wonderful speakers for the morning. In our second session, you will have the opportunity to collaborate. And through this breakout session, we would like to foster these networks, give you the opportunity to meet with other individuals from across these multiple countries. Please feel free to select in and out of this breakout room session after the coffee break. If you indicated at registration that you would like to participate, that is wonderful. It is still time to do so. You are more than welcome to join this breakout session in session 2 after our coffee break from 11:15 to 12 o'clock. Finally, we will look to the future. We will consider digital innovations and AI in possible future-proofing of ERPL processes and practices in a way that might help shape the process of ERPL, make it more transparent and easier for those who practice it and those for our learners. So it is a more learner-centered approach. Again, we have some wonderful speakers joining us this afternoon for this session. I should say that this conference is being hosted by the ERPL and Higher Education project here in Ireland, which is a HCI-funded initiative, a 6-year project funded by the government and co-sponsored by the Irish Universities Association and the Technological Universities Association. And I'm delighted to represent that project in hosting the conference. Even though we're hosting it here in Ireland. Of course, this project is part of the European ERPL network, whose work continues to represent national network and institutions of higher education working on ERPL. You can see here the goals of the European network. There are 11 countries already involved in this network, and we are very open to welcoming more countries and organizations onto the network. You'll see here on the right some of the organizations represented, and the links here will bring you into the LinkedIn page and also the website for further information. I would encourage you throughout the day to participate in this conference. As I said, there are 270 people registered, so it is a busy morning of people. We have disabled the chat function, but you please feel free to give your insights, share your thoughts, or pose some questions on our questions and answers function. I will do my best, as will my colleague Agnes, in picking up those questions and pose them to the panel at the relevant points during the day. So without further ado, let's start our morning. Our first session this morning is ERPL as a bridge for lifelong learning and stakeholder engagement. And we thought long and hard about these sessions. So we're posing this position as ERPL for access and ERPL as that bridge between education, human capital, organizations, and innovation. I'm going to welcome and start the conference with our first talk this morning entitled Flexible Learning Pathways. And this will be delivered by Christina Paulus, who's Head of Lifelong Learning Department at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Austria, and Marjaana Mäkelä, Principal Lecturer from Haaga-Helia University of Applied Sciences in Finland, and is also a member of the European University Alliance Ulysseus. So welcome, Christina, and welcome, Marjaana, and I will pass the floor to you for the moment.
Thank you, Ciara. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share now my presentation. Go in directly for the input. So from my side, I really welcome very warmly to this very interesting and important conference. To understand RPL and to understand flexible pathways, the first thing is to understand lifelong learning. And lifelong learning is the key issue when it comes to our learning is all through your life. It is really important that you know that all learning through life for the purpose of improving knowledge, skills, and competences is important within personal, civic, social, or employment and related perspectives. So I really want to foster and underline also your personal and civic perspective when it comes to lifelong learning. And it's understood as formal, non-formal, and informal learning. So the most important part of your life when it comes to learning is the informal part. And I ask you now for 1 minute to think why I am a lifelong learner and what is the informal part of my life in terms of learning. So 1 minute, please think of your self-reflection in terms of lifelong learning. Why are you a lifelong learner, and what does it mean for you that that informal learning is important? Okay, thank you for this first thought. I go to the next slide. Which is about evolving traditional university models, transforming to LLM institution. What does it mean? Especially when it comes to very traditional higher education institution, lifelong learning only plays a very small part within the institution. But when it comes to flexible pathways, when it comes to open university, it needs to identify key drivers and leaders of change. And it also needs to rethink your rigid academic models, embedding flexible and learner focus in all institutional processes, not only in one, but in all. Therefore, it needs to have a comprehensive institutional transformation. Transformation in a holistic LLM model involves building learning culture and innovation mindset. Openness and open mindsets is really needing. Also encouraging experimentation and collaboration among staff, and integrating lifelong learning principles into governance and curricula. So flexible pathways for lifelong learners are needed, are really needed. And because of society's need learning pathways that are flexible, inclusive, and quality assured, especially when it comes to higher education institutions, to make sure that quality assured pathways are really developed, focused, but also on upskilling and reskilling. We all know this, the skills agenda from the EU, so have that in mind. This is one of the key issues when it comes to flexible pathways. It can be supported and should be supported by RPL and can be supported by micro-credentials, also to ensure parallelity between education and employment. So what could be the future of RPL within 10 years? It can be also a time that you learn more to have a self-assessment or topic, which means to understand which topics or competences and skills you gain, develop, and further. And also need to choose a challenge or choose models of micro-credentials, which can be helpful for yourself and gain more competences within lifelong learning. And third, your learning pathway can be established, providing a structure between your competences and also gaining more micro-credentials. What could be the future of RPL in higher education institution? Our ERPL should be standardized through clear guidelines. It should be integrated within labor market frameworks, and it should be widely recognized and promoted among learners and professionals. So bridging the gap between theoretical strategies and practical execution is vital. But embedding lifelong learning into daily university operations requires actionable plans and dedicated efforts to translate vision into reality. One of the possibilities to promote flexible pathway could be micro-credentials. Micro-credentials enable modular learning that fits personal and professional needs, but to remove barriers of cost, time, and location, especially for underrepresented groups. A study of the EUR, which has been done 2024, shows that our flexible learning is increasing, and our 52% of our institutions, higher education institutions, increased their flexible learning offer in the past 5 years. But it needs there are no universal accepted standards, and there's also little guidance available for higher education institutions. And there are also different approaches between these institutions, even in the same institution. So there are two approaches which are really important. Flexible for learning, inclusive with a study program, and also flexibility in the format of non-degree credits or learning provisions, which may or may be not stackable to degrees. Stackability is also one important question when it comes to micro-credentials. And again, this should be really our quality assured, which is more and more important. So has been a study also on the provision of part-time programs. And as you can see, there are some institutions, which is in the light brown, that have more than 50% part-time programs or alternative study programs. And in the light brown, they are less than 50%. So I think it's increasing in the last 5 years, but there still are possibilities to go ahead for that. In terms of strategies of flexible pathways, the strategy of most higher education students attract international students, but also students from socio-economic disadvantaged studies students. So this is quite interesting when it comes to the strategy, because I think more and more higher education institutions have an impact on students with disabilities, also on refugee backgrounds, as you can see on the right-hand side. There are still obstacles, and there is also a lack of shared micro-credentials between standards, but also between regions and institutions. And what are another flexible learning pathways should have is that it should have more shared visions between institutions. It could be more centralized, but it could be also in terms of our design, a shift between various and managing types of infrastructure. And especially when it comes to management, the management of the curricula should be more, have more applications between curricula and courses. So the role of micro-credentials are formalize specific competences and make lifelong learning more learner-focused. Also, it requires a common frameworks, an inter-university transfer system, and a transparent quality assurance. One showcase I want to give you an impact this morning is volunteering. Volunteering, especially when it comes to service learning, means that students become more flexible, and they can also have an impact on their learning within the institution. Volunteering also has a benefit for increased self-confidence and life satisfaction. It gives you personal growth, but it also gives academic benefits and skills. There is a European quality standard in volunteering, especially when it comes to outcomes. And when it comes to access into education, it gives a big support through ERPL. So applying for a job, but also in terms of self-empowerment, there is a big chance in terms of flexible learning when you start volunteering work. As you know, there are 4 phases in ERPL existing, which is identification, documentation, and assessment, and certification. And all these 4 phases have an impact on the volunteering standards. So it has a structure, and it also has a volunteer-centered design. It encompasses inclusivity and accessibility, and also has specific standards to have external guidance. There is a very good best practice example in Germany. There are 4 universities which volunteering leadership within their higher education institutions, and you will find all information in the end of this talk. I now hand over to my colleague Marjaana. She will give you a very good example of flexible pathways at the Haaga-Helia University. Please, Marjaana.
Thank you so much, Christina. Thank you, Ciara, and very good morning to all of you. I'm happy to be presenting one very pragmatic example of the ways that Haaga-Helia has identified to address these challenges that Christina just presented. So we need to transform certain mindsets in our higher education institutions, and we also need to take in consideration the different frameworks of the labor market, which were also brought up by Christina. So if you can change to the next slide, please. So I'm presenting a kind of interesting piloting program, which was created a few years ago in my institution, Haaga-Helia University of Applied Sciences. And it's a degree program, a Bachelor of Hospitality Management, but with a very strong focus on work-integrated learning, or in some context is also called work-based learning, but I think that we are speaking of the same concept. So students are working and studying at the same time. And it is a bachelor consisting of 210 ECTS points and conducted as part-time studies. And for the moment, it has been arranged or structured as a specific application path to Haaga-Helia. So we also have other bachelors of hospitality management, but for this specific one, there is a specific intake. And it is targeted for applicants who really have a solid experience in hospitality business and a job in the field. So we need to or take in consideration the students and applicants who already have so much a different set of competencies in this business, so that they can really be put into practice, and that those competencies can also be demonstrated throughout their studies, because this is a program that is really structured as a combination of working and studying. And that also stands for the pedagogical concept that we have created at Haaga-Helia, which is called Work and Study, and you will find more information on that approach on our website. So the concept which we have developed, and it's nothing new as such, but it's maybe a new combination, a more structured way of taking into consideration the prior experience of applicants and thereafter students, but also of the work that they conduct on a daily basis, so that it's not only looking backwards as a recognition of things that have been, or competencies that have been acquired, but also a systematic framework and plan to validate the competencies that they will be acquiring in their job. And that's why we need a very solid plan for that kind of recognition. So at the beginning of studies, the recognition of prior formal learning will be, of course, conducted as it is in other programs at Haaga-Helia, and there is already a set of or a certain amount of ECTS that can be recognized at that point. And then for the rest of the studies, there is, as I said, a very systematic validation process of non-formal and informal learning. And this is something where our guidance counselors come into the picture. So every student goes very carefully through the curriculum already at the beginning of the studies and identifies the competencies that he or she has already acquired, and where the student assesses her competencies to be still lacking some components. So that is a very thorough set of self-assessment practices, and thereafter discussions with the guidance counselor that takes place at the very beginning of the studies. And I think that this is a very valuable component in this pedagogical approach, so that the curriculum or the understanding of the curriculum is also brought to the student at a very early phase of the studies. And then the studies, of course, they correspond to the curriculum of the Bachelor of Hospitality Management at Haaga-Helia in also other implementation modes. And the distinguishing factor is that the learning is conducted in one's own work for a very, or how would I say that, quite important percentage of the ECTS. But there is also more or less standard learning. So there are intensive days. There is learning conducted by lecturers. There is a lot of teamwork, so that it does not differ so much from other hybrid learning modes at Haaga-Helia, but for the fact that there is more self-directed and team-based learning than in other degree programs, and also that there is this work and study plan, which is designed individually for each student at the beginning of the studies, and which is monitored by the guidance counselor. And then lecturers carry out their work as they would also do in other programs, but with the difference. But in this program or in this implementation mode, the lecturers also work quite a lot in teams, and this also requires flexibility from the lecturers, and also referring to Christina's presentation. So it takes a different mindset from both the institution and the lecturers and the students in this type of pedagogical model. And then when studies go further, there is a very structured set of demonstrations of competencies. They can be conducted in a number of ways. Part of them are conducted in teams and part of them individually. But then there are also traditional exams and reports, and I would say that it's a very versatile pedagogical model altogether. And there are intensive days on campus, and competence-based curriculum that is really the main enabler for this kind of approach, so that the demonstrations and assessments can be carried out, and also that the student understands what is coming up. And can you please put the next slide, Christina? Christina, can you put, yes, thank you. So what is very important in this approach is also the peer support. So the students are gathered in teams where the students have quite similar positions, not necessarily exactly similar, but corresponding positions or corresponding contexts of work. So there might be restaurant managers, they might be hotel managers, they could work in travel agencies or in marketing of those fields. So that makes the possibility or enhances the possibility to conduct team assignments when the students know what each other are doing for their or in their own jobs. And I would say that this is quite a unique possibility to complete a higher education degree without interruption in one's career. Of course, it takes a lot of commitment, it takes a lot of investment, also time-wise, from students, but it has turned out to be quite a successful one in our institutions. But there is one thing that I would like to emphasize here at the end, and it is the endorsement of the employers. So we can't have students who would not have whose employers would not be aware of the studies that are being conducted in this program, because they also the idea is that the students can work with the authentic documents that they create, and also authentic processes they conduct in their own work, so that they can become part of the demonstration process in various courses. And of course, the confidentiality is required from all. So the lecturers, the guidance counselors, the students, and of course, that is towards the employers, which is necessary. But their endorsement is really valuable for the students and enhances the motivation. And it also strengthens the cooperation between the higher education institution and the labor market. So I would say that this is a win-win-win scenario for all. And just to finalize or to sum up, so for the higher education institution, this really takes or necessitates a dedicated team of lecturers and guidance counselors. That is one of the major keys to succeed in this kind of approach. So thank you very much. I will be happy to provide more information if anyone is interested in this kind of model. And here Christina is presenting the sources and literature that have been used for this, and where you can find more information on lifelong learning as a concept, and also some pragmatic examples. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marjaana and Christina, for your presentation and for actually setting the scene for today's conference. You pointed out the relevance of lifelong learning, and I really liked how you showed that we are all lifelong learning and it concerns basically us all. And thank you also for these very practical examples at the beginning of our conference to show how RPL is a bridge for lifelong learning. I am sure that many of the participants can relate to the challenges that you have mentioned already. And I'm sure there is a lot of thought for discussion and questions. And I invite all of you to write your questions in the Q&A that you can find on the bottom of your screen. There is a Q&A section, and you can write your questions whenever they come to your mind. We will pick them up later, Ciara and me, at the end of session 1, and try to answer some of them in writing. All right, thank you again, Christina and Marjaana, and we will now move on to the next part of our conference, which I have the pleasure to host together with my colleague Helene Peterbauer from the European University Association. Welcome, Helene, and also welcome other colleagues from the European RPL networks, which will support us with examples for RPL for Access, which we'll be talking about. I will introduce you later. My name is Agnes Witzani. I work at the Austrian Agency for Quality Assurance and Accreditation, and we are all members of the European RPL network. I will now share my screen, so please give me a second here. Yes. So welcome to our session on RPL for Access in Europe. With this session, we want to take a closer look at how RPL can be a bridge into higher education. So to look at recognizing prior learning for accessing higher education. And we have discussed this issue in the European RPL network during the past year and found that the legal frameworks vary quite a lot across Europe, and also the practice of using RPL for access or admission varies. While we believe that the impact and benefit of applying RPL for access is very high, many countries still hesitate or do not allow the use of RPL for access. So that is why with this session, we want to show examples where and how RPL is used for access in practice and is therefore a bridge into higher education. And let me show you what we plan during the next hour that we have for this part of the conference. We will start with an introduction, a definition and insights into the results of recent policy reports. Then, as mentioned before, 4 colleagues from the network will give insights into examples from their countries, which are Scotland, Sweden, Malta, and Ireland. And then we dedicate 25 minutes to breakout sessions, where we'll be split into smaller groups and discuss challenges, practice, and success factors in RPL for Access with you, and are very much looking forward to learning more about your experiences and other examples from your countries. But first of all, let us start with clarifying what are we talking about. And Helene, I would like to hand this question to you. What do we mean when we use the term RPL for access?
Indeed. Thank you, Agnes, for introducing me and for introducing our topic, because we really should clarify what we actually mean when we talk about RPL for accessing higher education. So generally, the key term here is still RPL, meaning recognition of prior learning, which, as defined by the 2012 Council of the European Union recommendation, is the validation of all learning outcomes, namely knowledge, skills, and competences acquired through non-formal and informal learning, based on the general philosophy that was also very clear in Christina's presentation, that nobody should be required to study something they already know based on other sources of knowledge obtaining. And when we talk about RPL for accessing higher education in particular, we are simply talking about an alternative route to enter higher education, specifically through the recognition of prior skills and knowledge gained through a combination. Here we talk about the practice really of RPL for access. So a combination of formal, non-formal, and informal learning. But there are a few caveats with this, because as I think will be clear once we talk about what we found in the course of our investigation into the topic, there is actually quite a big difference between RPL for accessing higher education, whereas the actual practice of ensuring that RPL is used for admitting people to specific study programs or courses. And another important distinction, when we talk about RPL for access, we are talking about something different than RPL for either progression or credits, which is comparatively more common in the European higher education area, which is that RPL is used to allow students to be exempt from courses and having to retake exams and retake courses because they already proved that they already know the content of these courses.
Thank you, Helene, for clarifying that. I think it's very important to know what we are talking about. And we already got examples for RPL for credits from our previous presenters when Marjaana talked about their example in Finland. And what was really surprising when we discussed it in the network was that some countries actually, for them, it's easier. In some countries, it's easier to recognize prior learning for credits, and in some, it's easier to recognize prior learning for access. And we found that was quite surprising, and thought it was important to dive into that topic a bit more. So on that point, Helene, what do we know about RPL for access in the higher education area so far?
Well, we do know, just to sum it up, that there is some room for improvement. We can talk a lot about the potential benefits of RPL for accessing higher education, specifically for the individual, but also at the institutional and system level, because it creates more diversity of learner perspectives. It allows the higher education system or institution to draw on a broader diversity of talented learners, which of course has also an impact on the societal and economic level, because you make so much more use of the potential in your workforce, in your population. And for these reasons, RPL, specifically for access in general, but also for accessing higher education, is actually a long-standing Bologna process commitment already for 20 years, if you can believe it. Since the 2005 Bergen Communiqué, it has been a commitment of the countries in the European higher education area through the Bologna process. But still, there are substantial gaps in its actual implementation. So, for example, the 2024 Bologna process implementation report, which looks at the national level, so into national level policies, found that only 21 out of 49 higher education systems allow for RPL for access, so less than half. Then we also looked into the student perspective, the 2024 Bologna with Students' Eyes report, which is a little bit of a counter report to the Bologna process implementation report, because it is based on the perspectives and experiences of student unions. reports that only 17 higher education systems in Europe allow for the use of RPL for enrolling in higher education, as opposed to 22 systems which allow for RPL for progress. So here you already see several distinctions. RPL for progress seems to be a little bit more common in the European higher education area, according to the student perspective. But you also notice that we pointed out that the Bologna process implementation report talks about RPL for access, whereas the student perspective report talks about RPL for enrolling in higher education. So here we are actually moving into the admission part of RPL. This is then also confirmed by the Trends 2024 report, which Christina already referred to before. This is a report published by the European University Association, and it is based on survey results of higher education institutions. And according to our survey results, only 21% of the surveyed institutions allow RPL for admission to higher education. And this distinction makes, of course, sense because the Bologna process implementation report talks about policies, national policies, whereas the students' eyes reports and the trends reports talk about the student reality and the institutional reality, which are naturally more interested in admission. But it really shows that there is a difference between RPL for access at the policy level and what it actually means for admissions using RPL. But also, just very briefly before I hand over back to you, Agnes, this Bologna with Students' Eyes report also pointed out very important barriers to RPL in general, which I think are often confirmed by our daily experience. So they refer to a lack of trust in the quality of RPL procedures or in the validation of non-formal and informal outcomes qualifications. They point to a lack of top-level coordination from the national authority to make sure that RPL is actually implemented. And another important barrier highlighted by the Students' Eyes reports is that there seems to be limited information or also a lack of trust from higher education institutions towards other education providers. So there seems to be a disconnect of trust in between who is allowed to provide knowledge and skills. And I think this might sound quite familiar to all of us.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much, Helene, for summing that up. It is quite surprising to see that even with the differences of admission and access, but still a maximum of half or not even half of the higher education systems in the European higher education area allow for RPL for access, which, of course, you pointed out the barriers there might be and the problems. But we do not want to focus now on the deficit side. We want to focus on the positive examples that there are and use them as an inspiration, use them for other higher education systems to learn from. So thank you, Helene. That is why now I'm very happy and glad to move over to our country examples, as we called it. Of course, in the European RPL network, as Ciara introduced, there are 11 countries represented, and we know that there are much more countries out there implementing RPL for credits or for access. But we now want to showcase 4 countries of the network that are part of the network where RPL for access is implemented and is allowed for. And we asked our colleagues from the countries to give us a very brief introduction, and each of the colleagues has 4 minutes and 1 slide, so it will be quite fast, to give you just an overview and hints. How is RPL for access understood in the respective country? How is it implemented? And what are main challenges? But most of all, what are success factors for implementing RPL for access? And I now want to start with welcoming Paul White, who is Transnational Lead at the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework Partnership from Scotland. And please, we are very excited to learn about RPL for access in Scotland. Paul.
Thank you, Agnes. Good morning, everyone. And as Agnes said, my name is Paul White. I'm the Transnational Lead at the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework Partnership. We're the small independent organisation which maintains Scotland's National Qualifications Framework. And I'm happy to share a short overview of how RPL supports access to higher education in Scotland. RPL is embedded in Scotland's lifelong learning and widening access to higher education practice. It allows individuals to have learning from work, volunteering, or life experience recognised and to use that learning as a route into higher education. And in recent years, we've seen an increase in innovative projects and resources developed to support this, all designed to make access routes more flexible and inclusive, ensuring that all learning matters. Scotland doesn't have a single national RPL authority. Instead, institutions design their own RPL policies, but these are aligned with national guidance. Two key reference points support this: the Quality Assurance Agency for Scotland's Framework for RPL, which provides RPL guidance for the tertiary sector, and the SCQF Partnership's RPL principles, which set out a consistent approach for recognising prior learning within Scotland's national qualifications framework. Together, these frameworks ensure that RPL remains both credible and adaptable within Scotland's diverse education system. Turning to what works well, there are several clear success factors in the Scottish context. Firstly, there are strong articulation pathways between colleges and universities. These allow learners with higher national certificates and diplomas, short cycle qualifications, gained from colleges to enter directly into the second or third year of a university degree. This is a practical and well-established example of RPL in action. Secondly, the widespread embracement of the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework, or SCQF, provides a common language across all of Scottish education. This promotes parity of esteem between vocational and academic routes and helps institutions and learners map prior experience against recognised qualification levels. And thirdly, we have a growing base of resources and case studies, all available in the SCQF Partnership's RPL Hub. These showcase how RPL can be applied in practice and support both staff and learners to engage with the process confidently. But of course, there are still challenges. There's variation in practice between institutions as policies are locally managed. Institutions which have far more applications than they have places often don't feel the need to utilise RPL. Some institutions also lack the dedicated resources needed to sustain RPL activity. Awareness among learners and sometimes among staff remains relatively low, meaning that opportunities can be missed. And across the system, there is a need for greater consistency and coordination, as well as a need for more tangible data on the positive impact on RPL for access. The good news is that work is already underway to address these concerns. At the direction of the Scottish Government, the SCQF Partnership has started exploring the development of a coordinated national system for RPL, recognising its potential to widen access, to make our education and skills system more efficient, and to ensure all learning counts. A steering group has been formed and the future for RPL in Scotland looks bright. So to sum up, RPL for access in Scotland is firmly embedded and supported by strong frameworks, but there's room to improve consistency, awareness, and resourcing. It's a well-established practice with real potential to make learning more flexible and inclusive, ensuring that prior learning truly opens doors to higher education for everyone. Thank you, and I look forward to speaking to some of you in the breakout session later.
Thank you, Paul, for that insight. Unfortunately, we cannot go into depth right now, but I want to remind you all to use the Q&A function to pose any questions you might have to Paul. We will pick some questions up later at the end of session 1. And in the meantime, any very specific questions we will also answer in writing. Thank you, Paul. Let's move to our second country example, Sweden. I welcome Cecilia Tort, who is Senior Credential Evaluator at the Swedish Council for Higher Education. Cecilia, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and present a short insight into RPL for Access, the Swedish case then. And as you can see here on this slide, legislation is in place in Sweden, and the Rectors Conference has also issued a recommendation with a general description of the ideal process. But RPL is a case for each individual HIE to implement and work with. So entry requirements for higher education courses and programs in Sweden are expressed in general and possibly also specific requirements. And these are usually described in terms of subjects from upper secondary school. And there are formulated learning outcomes for these subjects, and these are then used as standards in the RPL process. And Sweden has a joint admission system to more or less all higher education programs and courses, and students need to indicate then that they apply via RPL, and all applications with RPL indications are then referred to the local admissions office. at the HIE which the student applied to. But let me take an example. We have a person who has been working as a social secretary for several years without a degree, but now new legislation requires a formal diploma from a university. So this person never finalized upper secondary school and hence doesn't fulfill the formal requirements. And in the joint admissions process, this person's apply for RPL when applying for a social work program. This application is then referred to the HIE. The admissions staff locally checked the documentation, etc., which has been submitted. And depending on the case, the applicant can also be called to an interview and might also need to write a test. And generally said, apropos what Agnes was mentioning, it's often easier for students to get approval of an RPL application for access in Sweden. It could be for general access or for specific requirement. And this is often easier than it is to be successful in an application for RPL for credits. And it's interesting, and maybe we can discuss this later on in the breakout rooms, because it's indeed a difference to many other countries. Well, of course, theory is one thing, practice is another story. So for the challenges, some HIEs have done more work than others on RPL. This means that the process differs between institutions, and students often don't realize this, that they need to contact the counseling service well in advance, and they do have to do thorough work with their application. They need to document and describe their competencies and submit this with their application. Also, there's often competition to be admitted to a program, for instance, the social work program. And even if the student is successful and eligible for access, RPL doesn't render any merit for competition and admission. And so the students are encouraged to take the Swedish Scholastic Aptitude Test for competition. And in other words, they need to plan their application well in advance. And then also, finally, as always, there is the issue regarding funding. So higher education institutions, they don't get any extra funding for the more hands-on RPL process, which we have for access, even if the society as such, and maybe also the institution, understands the gain when students don't need to study things they already know. So that's it from me. Very short, but still looking forward to see you later on in the breakout rooms. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia, so much also for the practical example, which always helps with understanding the different contexts, I believe. I already see that there are common challenges across the countries, like the lack of resources and funding, which is not a surprise, and that a consistent common approach seems to be missing often and would be helpful. So something to discuss further in the breakout rooms. Let's move on to this to our next country example, and I welcome Gaetano Calleja from the Malta Further and Higher Education Authority. Welcome, Gaetano. Malta, a country with a strong national approach, and we are very curious to learn about RPL for access in Malta. Gaetano, please.
Thank you very much, Agnes, and thank you for all the participants taking part in this conference. The interest that the European RPL network is generating on this issue. In Malta, I am in charge of the validation unit of non-formal and informal teaching and learning, the RPL, the VIMFIL, and all other forms of alternative learning pathways. In our country, RPL is nationally coordinated by us, coordinated through various means, and implemented at an institutional level. We coordinate the process in order to guarantee standards, standardization, and quality assurance. The Malta Further and Higher Education Authority provides comprehensive guidelines that establish the principles and practices for all providers which must be followed by higher and further institutions. These guidelines ensure that RPL is applied consistently and fairly across all our institutions. The framework balances institutional flexibility with sector-wide quality standards, protecting both learners and academic integrity. In our case, RPL is coordinated at a national level by providing a framework based on 3 pillars: the excess provision, the unit exemption, and the 50% maximum of the program's total requirements. So RPL by any institution can be applied up to 50% of the program and not for the whole program in course. Now, the institution has to apply with MFHEA in order to be given the license to apply RPL in its programs. So there's a formal application which the institution has to apply. Then when we receive that application, MFHEA evaluates that application through also our external experts to see that the application is compliant, compliant with national guidelines as well as with European standards, especially CEDEFOP guidelines in the matter. Then, once it is approved, it is up to the institution to implement the process. We also follow quality assurance exercises by also visiting centers and conducting on-site visits to see how the process actually is taking place. We are not only interested in forming the guidelines, in establishing rules, but we are more interested to see how these guidelines are being implemented. Success stories, we can mention the June 2025 second edition of the launching of the new guidelines. And thanks to that edition and to the publicity, we noticed a rise in the number of RPL applications from various institutions. That is, more institutions now are ready to provide RPL in their programs. Challenges regarding sometimes the cultural resistance, the idea that RPL could be something suitable for people who may not be fully qualified for a program. We're trying to overcome that certain cultural bias, and also the importance to build trust with the institutions, with stakeholders, the importance of better communication so that we can promote together RPL and different forms and different pathways for lifelong learning. It is something, RPL, together with all the other forms of lifelong learning, it is something which cannot be done by one institution, but it needs the teamwork of all the stakeholders involved. Thank you very much, and excuse me for taking some more than the 4 minutes allowed.
Thank you, Gaetano, for those insights and for stressing that trust and communication is key, and of course the collaboration of all stakeholders. Looking forward to discussing that further in a few minutes. But now I am happy to introduce to you our fourth country example. Welcome Claire Walsh from Ireland, from the RPL in Higher Education project. We know that Ireland has a lot of experience with RPL for Access. You're actually our role model to look to, basically. So I'm very happy to have you here and excited to learn about RPL for Access in Ireland. Welcome, Claire.
Many thanks, Agnes, for the welcome, and I'm delighted to join you here today. My name is Claire Walsh, and I will briefly explain how RPL for Access is understood and implemented in higher education in Ireland. I'm giving you the perspectives of how RPL for Access is utilised, primarily from the knowledge and experience gained through the RPL in Higher Education project here in Ireland. This government-funded project has 14 partner universities and was initiated in 2021. Over the last 4 years, we have collaborated with our partner institutions to create the RPL Toolkit for Staff in Higher Education, which is supported by a range of RPL exemplars of practice, including RPL for Access. It is from these exemplars, the practice perspectives I present to you today are drawn from, and in a sense then can be considered an evidence-based approach. However, firstly, I think it's important to note there are a number of national policies that support RPL, including the Access Transfer and Progression Policy, the National Access Plan, the National Skills Strategy, and of course the project's own RPL pilot framework, which was agreed upon by the 14 partner universities. Now, while there is no national RPL policy, QQI are in the process of preparing a green paper for consultation. Institutional RPL policies and procedures are mostly well established, and with many RPL policies updated over the lifetime of this project. Now, just to kind of formalise how we understand RPL for Access, we consider it to be RPL for Access as a mechanism an individual can use to apply for entry to a programme when they do not meet the entry criteria. That's generally how it's understood. It's generally accepted that the RPL for Access process includes mapping of informal and non-formal learning to a standard. And these standards are typically understood to include the National Framework of Qualifications Generic Award Standards, the NFQ Grid of Level Indicators, and of course, in some cases, programme learning outcomes where specified. Now, moving on, there's also a strong relationship between institutional quality assurance and RPL practice, with evidence of RPL embedded in new programme development, curriculum design, and assessment policies, for example. Decision-making related to RPL applications typically reside with academics, such as those individuals responsible for programmes and/or departments, but can also include panels or programme boards, for example. Many of the exemplars that we have created in collaboration with our partners provide evidence of RPL for Access, and what we see, they're applied in lifelong learning contexts where individuals are participating in part-time programmes, for example. We do see this too. In relation to the success factors, what we see, evidence from the project demonstrates the importance of high level of commitment from policymakers, institutional leaders, and of course, practitioners. Support from institutional leaders really is viewed as an enabler of RPL. Other success factors include institutional RPL policy and procedures that clearly establish approaches to practice. This in turn influences the inclusion of RPL as a core component in curriculum development processes, including how programme entry criteria are written. Finally, but not limited to, of course, support for RPL applicants is viewed as a significant factor in the learner RPL journey. Moving on to challenges, there remains much to do in terms of awareness raising amongst the various stakeholder groups, including potential learners, staff of higher education institutions, as well as employers. Staff of higher education institutions have busy substantive roles and are often considered to lack the additional capacity to facilitate the various stages of the RPL process. The issues of funding and data are intertwined, and the absence of maybe a national systematic approach to RPL data makes the argument for RPL funding more complex. However, it should be noted there are really good recent developments on the data front, with RPL now included in the ongoing update of the student record system within the HEA. On that note, I'll come to a conclusion, and just to highlight the RPL toolkit for staff in higher education and exemplars of RPL for Access are available on powerlearning.ie. Do check them out. Thank you, Agnes.
Thank you, Claire, for those insights. I really recommend looking at the resources. We will, of course, make all the presentations from today made available after the conference, and you will have the links and also contacts. Yeah, very interesting. And thank you for pointing out the success factors. I would love to discuss further how the commitment across all levels can be reached and can be gained. But we will leave the discussions now for the breakout rooms. We will now have 25 minutes where we will split into smaller groups. Each breakout room will be hosted by one of the speakers or another member of the network. Let me say that it will be coincidental how breakout rooms are put together, and breakout rooms will not be recorded. So they're really purely for your discussions. And we are really from the European RPL network, and those who currently research and work on the topic of RPL for Access. We are really interested and curious to learn from you now in the breakout rooms. We would like to know, how is RPL used for access to higher education in your countries? What works? What doesn't work? How can it be improved? And of course, what do you consider key success factors to enable an impactful implementation of RPL?